Hey guys, my name is Frank, this is Pop Vlog, and today I'm going to show you how to make a touch controller for a game. So right now I'm using the DevTools emulator, so I can only have one touch input, but this does work for multiple touches. I've implemented smooth movement, so if I am touching the screen, I can move my finger between buttons, and they work pretty well. There's no hiccups or anything like that. I could have multiple touches, even though I'm not using a multi-touch device. You can have multiple touches, so you can run and you can jump at the same time, and it's glorious, and everything works out really well. So I'm not using actual HTML elements. I'm using the canvas to draw these buttons, and I think it's better that way because you're not relying on CSS to position your user input. You're drawing everything to the screen. You know where it's going to be drawn to. So I suggest drawing your buttons to the screen rather than using HTML elements to do that. Another thing I suggest is make your buttons pretty big and make sure that it's like an intuitive layout, because you don't want your users, because you can't feel the buttons, so you don't want your users just really into your game and your layout kind of isn't very intuitive. So they're looking at the game screen and they're trying to touch the buttons and they can't get them because they can't feel them, and makes the game harder to play. So anyway, this is my button class. It's basically just a rectangle with a color and an active value. So active is true when I'm touching a button, and active is false when I'm not touching a button. Inside the button prototype, I have the contains point function, which just takes the x and y coordinate of my touch object, because when you touch the screen, it creates a touch object, and I then will hand that to the button's contain point function to see whether or not it's inside of the button's rectangle. You could also do a circle or whatever you want. I'm just using a rectangle because it's easy, but you basically just want to test to see if the point is inside whatever shape your button is. So down here I have my controller object, and that has everything to do with my controls inside of it. So I have a buttons array, and I create some buttons. I've got my 3 buttons. I have my jump button, my left and right buttons. As you can see, they all work nicely. And then I have the test buttons function. Now the test buttons function is basically all you need to know. And you don't need to know this stuff down here. This is just for my output. I have some output right here. Just shows what button is being pressed and stuff like that. But the whole block right here is the important stuff. This whole block right here, that's really all that matters. And then we also have our event handlers. So I added some event listeners for touch end, touch move, and touch start at the bottom of the program. I'm not going to scroll down there because it's like a 300 line program and tend to get lost coming back. So I'm not going to go down there. I'm just going to tell you I define those event listeners. So these are the event handlers, and they're all pretty much the same. If you look at them, they do the same exact thing. First of all, they prevent default, which is very important, because if I'm going to touch my screen and I'm trying to touch this button and my finger accidentally moves a little bit, I don't want my browser to think I'm trying to scroll. So to prevent native actions of your browser, just use prevent default, and it'll prevent you from scrolling or zooming or anything else, which is pretty nice. So then the other thing that happens in all of these event handlers is test buttons is called, and I hand it the target touches event object. So every time I touch the screen, that touch object is created inside of a target touches list. So if I touch the screen with 2 fingers, the target touches list is created, and inside of it are both of those touch objects. The same thing happens no matter how many fingers you touch on the screen. I'm not sure if there's a limit. I would imagine 10 is more than you would ever need at once. So I can't imagine that you would ever need, 50 touches on the screen at once. It just doesn't make sense. So not really relevant. I'm just, just saying, why would you need more than 10? Why would you really need more than, 4? 4 seems like too many. But anyway, you take those target touches, and this is where the controller logic comes into play. So you hand this function your target touches, and you're going to loop through. First, you're going to loop through your buttons, and then you're going to loop through your touches. So when you loop through your buttons, you're going to set all of their active values to false. This way, on any touch event, whether it's touch start, touch move, or touch end, all of these buttons are going to be assumed to not be pressed. We're going to assume that they're not going to be pressed. That might be a better way to put that. So anyway, basically, none of these are pressed at the start of any touch event. To determine whether or not we're touching them, we have to loop through our touches and see if any of those are inside of a button. And this works great because if I don't have any touches on the screen, say the only event that fired was a touch end event and it was on my last touch, so now I have 0 touches in my touch list, my target touches list, all my buttons will already have been set to false. None of this will execute because I have no touch objects in my target touches array. In the case that I do have one or more touches in my target touches array, I'm going to test those touches against my button rectangles with the button.contains_point function. So all this does is it tests to see if the position of our touch object is inside of the rectangle. But it's a little more complicated than that because you have to make adjustments depending on where your canvas is on the screen and whether or not your application scales. So on mobile, your application is always going to scale, and you need to set up a ratio between your actual base coordinate system. So if you're familiar with game design, you have something sort of like world coordinates and then real display coordinates. Say your game world is, say you're playing Game Boy, and on the Game Boy screen you have, I don't know what the actual thing, let's say it's 256 pixels by 256 pixels, and you have a nice square. Now, if you're emulating that on a screen, it might be larger, it might be smaller. Say you scale it up to 512 pixels, then you're going to have to multiply by 2, so your scale factor will be 2. Well, it's the same thing here. Since this scales, my world coordinates are going to have to be scaled up to my screen coordinates, and since I'm getting touch input on my screen coordinates, I'm going to have to scale those down to my world coordinates, which is where my buttons are actually being drawn to. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, I suggest you fiddle around with this a little bit because explanation is not my strong point. Writing code is my strong point. So anyway, to just go through this, we take our touch client X position, which is just the X position of our touch event. We subtract from it the left-hand side of our output canvas, which will make our touch position relative to the top left corner of our canvas, which is what we want. And then we take that value and we multiply it by our buffer canvas to our output display canvas ratio. So that's that 256 to 512, that Game Boy screen to emulator screen ratio that I was talking about. And that takes care of scaling our touch position down to something we can use in our game world. And then we do the same thing for the Y. We just subtract the bounding rectangle's top position of our output canvas from our touch's client Y position, and then we multiply that by the same ratio, and it all works nicely. So if I scale this down really far, we can still play and things still work pretty nice. Without this scale ratio, things just wouldn't work at all. Sometimes they might work, sometimes, most of the time they're not going to work because our input is going to be someplace that we don't expect it to be. And if those coordinates are inside of our button, we just set the button active to true, and we can call break. And because once we know that a touch point is inside of one of our buttons, we don't need to test if any other touches are inside of that button, because once it's touched once, it's active. If it's touched twice, it's no more active than it was when it was touched before. So we don't need to test any of those other touch objects to see if they're inside of our rectangle. So we just break out of the touch loop and we go on to our next button. So it's that simple. I'm not going to really go too much into detail on the rest of the application because there's quite a few lines of code, and it's mostly just for organizational purposes. I decided to organize things into logical groups. So I have my controller, I have my display for my graphics, and I have my game logic and my game object. And it just makes it easier for portability. Say, I mean, this is a perfect example. Say I want to have this run on a desktop and on a mobile device. If I store all my code for the controller inside of a controller object, I can just come down here, cut this controller object out of my source code, and replace it with a controller object that takes keyboard input. Really simple. And then the other thing I'd have to change would be down here at the bottom. I would have to change my touch event listeners to mouse event listeners or keyboard event listeners. So by creating these logical groups and separating all my game logic from my controller logic and my graphics logic or my display logic, it makes it really easy to remove code, put new code in, and it's not super useful for JavaScript, but it's more useful for things like C++ and other languages. So plus it just organizes your code so it's easier to, go through, especially when your application gets really large, and it definitely will get really large. Actually, I will show you one more thing, and that's down here in my game loop. Come all the way down here to my game loop, and I'm just going to show you that getting information from the system is just as easy as it would be from getting information from my keyboard input control layout. So to get information from my different buttons, I'm just using the buttons array, which is, you saw it before in the controller object. I could give these buttons individual names, but I mean, there's only 3 of them, so I figured this was easy enough. And you just test that active value, and if it's active, you execute the appropriate game logic, and if it's not, then you don't. So it's that simple. So I'm going to put a link to the source code and the working example in the description of the video. Check it out on my GitHub, and hope you guys learned something. If not, let me know in the comments. How can I improve? Trying to make videos here, so if there's any way I can improve, let me know and I'll give it a shot. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Have a good day.